The alarm clock read 5:47 a.m. when Michelle Andera opened her eyes. She hadn't needed the alarm in years. Her body had long since learned to wake before the world did, trained by 7 years of early mornings, quiet routines, and the unspoken understanding that someone had to hold everything together before the day began its demands. She lay still for a moment, staring at the pale ceiling above her, listening to the sound of Robert's steady breathing beside her. Even in sleep, he looked like a man who owned the room. She rose without waking him. She always did. The kitchen was cold at that hour, the marble floor smooth beneath her bare feet as she moved through the motions she knew by heart. Coffee, black, 2 sugars for Robert. Eggs, lightly scrambled, with toast cut diagonally the way he preferred. Orange juice, freshly squeezed, because he had once mentioned years ago that the bottled kind tasted artificial, and Michelle had never bought bottled juice again since that day. She set the table with the same quiet precision she brought to everything. Napkin folded, utensils aligned, a single small flower from the garden placed in the center because she believed that beauty in small things mattered, even when no one noticed. No one ever noticed. But Michelle kept placing the flower anyway. She had not always been this quiet. Those who knew Michelle before Robert, her university friends, her colleagues from the marketing firm where she had once worked with sharp instincts and sharper ambition, would have struggled to recognize the woman she had become. The Michelle they remembered laughed loudly at bad jokes, argued passionately about ideas, and walked into rooms like she had somewhere important to be. Marriage had not broken that woman. Not immediately. Not all at once. It had happened the way all slow erosions happen, gradually, imperceptibly, one small compromise at a time. The first year had been genuinely beautiful. Robert was charming then, attentive in the way that new love makes people attentive, and Michelle had given herself to that love completely and without reservation. She believed in him before anyone else did. When Robert's first business venture failed spectacularly, leaving them with debt that felt suffocating and a future that felt uncertain, it was Michelle who sat across from him at their small kitchen table and said, "We'll rebuild. Together." And they did. Except the rebuilding was never quite as equal as that word suggested. Michelle quietly left her job at the marketing firm. Robert needed someone to manage the administrative side of his new venture, and hiring staff was a luxury they couldn't afford. She told herself it was temporary. She would go back to her career once things stabilized, once the business found its footing, once Robert didn't need her quite so completely. That stability never came in the way she imagined. The business grew, slowly at first, then with gathering momentum, and each stage of its growth seemed to require more of Michelle, not less. She handled the accounts, chased invoices, negotiated with suppliers, maintained client relationships, and managed the household simultaneously, all while Robert focused on the vision and the strategy and the public face of their enterprise. She was the engine room. He was the captain. And in their world, only the captain received the applause. She told herself she didn't mind. That love meant contribution without a scoreboard. That a good marriage was not a transaction. She told herself this often enough that she almost stopped noticing it wasn't entirely true. The money they had invested in saving Robert's first business had come from Michelle's personal savings. 5 years of disciplined accumulation from her working years. A fund she had built with a vague intention of someday starting something of her own. She gave it without hesitation when Robert needed it. Later, when a second crisis threatened to undo their progress, she sold the jewelry her mother had left her. A delicate gold necklace with a small pearl pendant, a pair of earrings worn at her parents' wedding, a bracelet engraved with words in a language that meant you are enough. She packed them into a small velvet pouch and handed them to the jeweler without allowing herself to cry until she was back in the car alone. Then she dried her eyes, drove home, and told Robert the problem was solved. He said, "Good. I knew you'd figure it out." He never asked what she had sold. As the years passed and Robert's business grew into something genuinely impressive, their social life expanded accordingly. Dinner parties with investors, galas with corporate partners, Weekend retreats with the kind of people who discuss property portfolios the way ordinary people discuss the weather. Michelle attended every event on Robert's arm, dressed appropriately, spoke when spoken to, laughed at the right moments, and made herself pleasant without making herself prominent. She learned quickly that Robert preferred it that way. On the rare occasions she had offered an opinion at these gatherings, a perspective on a market trend she had observed, a thought about a business strategy she had noticed a flaw in, Robert would smile tightly and redirect the conversation. Later, in the car home, he would say things like, "You don't need to try so hard," or "These aren't really your kind of conversations, Michelle." She stopped offering opinions at dinners. Then she stopped offering them at home. It was simply easier. Less friction. Less of that particular silence that fell after he dismissed her that felt somehow louder than any argument. Robert's colleagues praised him endlessly. His family, who had initially been skeptical of his ambitions, became his most devoted audience as success validated every risk he had taken. At family gatherings, his mother spoke of him with a reverence usually reserved for royalty. His brothers sought his advice. His father, once critical, now boasted about him to neighbors with unconcealed pride. And Michelle, she sat at these gatherings and refilled plates and made sure everyone had enough to drink and smiled warmly at stories she had heard many times. She was introduced as Robert's wife, always in relation to him, never quite as herself. She wore the title with something she had convinced herself was pride, not recognizing for a long time that what she was actually wearing was erasure. Behind closed doors, the man she had married had become someone increasingly difficult to recognize. The charm that had once been directed toward her had redirected itself entirely outward, reserved for clients, for colleagues, for anyone whose opinion carried professional consequence. At home, Robert was impatient, dismissive. His words, when they came, often arrived edged with a contempt that he seemed barely aware of and that Michelle had learned to absorb without visible reaction. "Why would you think that's a good idea? You really don't understand how this works, do you? I don't need your input on this, Michelle. Just let me handle it." She told herself he was stressed, that building a business at the level he was operating required intensity that sometimes spilled over, that this was not who he truly was, that the man she had fallen in love with was still in there, simply buried beneath pressure and ambition and exhaustion. She believed this because the alternative, that she had spent 7 years of her life, her savings, her mother's jewelry, her career, and her sense of self on a man who had never truly seen her, was a thought too enormous to hold. So Michelle Andera woke at 5:47 every morning. She made the coffee and the eggs and the orange juice. She placed the flour on the table that no one noticed. She smiled at dinners, stayed silent at gatherings, and loved a man with a completeness and a faithfulness that he had long since stopped deserving. She stayed because she believed in him, because she loved him, and that love, patient, selfless, and absolute, was about to cost her everything she had left. She just didn't know it yet, not on that particular morning. Not when she placed the flour on the breakfast table and heard Robert's shower running upstairs, the sound as familiar and unremarkable as the ticking of the kitchen clock. Not when he came downstairs, straightened his tie in the hallway mirror without glancing at the table she had set, picked up his coffee, and left for the office with nothing more than a distracted, "I'll be late tonight," tossed over his shoulder like an afterthought. She stood in the kitchen long after the front door closed, her hands wrapped around her own cup, and told herself that today would be different, that she would do something to close the distance that had grown between them, quietly, steadily, like a river widening its banks without anyone noticing until the gap was too wide to cross. She decided she would cook his favorite meal. It seemed, at the time, like a reasonable place to start. The market was busy that Tuesday afternoon, filled with the ordinary noise of ordinary life, vendors calling out prices, children pulling at their mother's sleeves, the smell of fresh bread and cut flowers mixing in the open air. Michelle moved through it all with a careful list and something fragile flickering in her chest that she chose to call hope. She selected ingredients with the kind of attention she gave to everything, the freshest vegetables, the right cut of meat, a bottle of wine she had quietly saved for an occasion that felt worthy. She even stopped at a small flower stall and bought a bundle of white roses, thinking she would arrange them on the dining table, light the candles she had been saving, and create an evening that reminded them both of who they used to be to each other. She carried it all home in 2 heavy bags, slightly breathless by the time she reached their building, already composing the evening in her mind. The soft music she would play, the way the candlelight would warm the room, the conversation she hoped they might finally have, honest and gentle and long overdue. She took the elevator up. She shifted the groceries to one arm to find her key. She opened the door, and the carefully composed evening she had been carrying fell apart before she crossed the threshold. The groceries hit the floor first. She didn't feel them leave her hands. What she saw in the living room of the home she had spent 7 years building, the home where she had cried alone on nights Robert worked late, the home where she had painted the walls herself because they couldn't afford a decorator, the home where she had placed flowers on the table every single morning hoping someone would notice, unraveled something fundamental inside her. Vanessa, her Vanessa, the woman who had sat beside her at her mother's funeral and held her hand through the entire service. The woman who knew every wound Michelle carried because Michelle had trusted her with every one of them. The woman who had listened to Michelle's quiet fears about her marriage over coffee just 3 weeks ago and said, "He doesn't deserve you, but I'm sure it'll get better." She was standing in Robert's arms with a familiarity that made it immediately, devastatingly clear that this was not new. For a moment, no one moved. Then Robert stepped back. He did not look panicked. He did not look ashamed. He straightened his collar with the calm, deliberate motion of a man who had mentally rehearsed this moment and decided, long ago, exactly how he intended to play it. His expression was not guilty. It was resolved. He looked at Michelle the way someone looks at a problem they have finally decided to stop managing. "I've been meaning to tell you for a while now, Michelle." His voice was level, almost reasonable. "You were never really the right woman for where I'm going. Vanessa understands my world. I want a divorce." The words arrived with a clarity that was somehow worse than cruelty. There was no heat in them, no regret. They were simply a closing statement, a door being shut on something he had already mentally vacated long before tonight. Michelle's mouth opened. No sound came. She looked at Vanessa, searching for something, guilt, apology, even the decency of shame. Vanessa met her eyes for only a moment before glancing away, her jaw set in a way that Michelle recognized as the expression of someone who had already made their peace with a decision they knew was wrong. "How long?" Michelle finally heard herself ask. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. Robert checked his watch. "That's not really the conversation I want to have tonight." "How long, Robert?" A pause. 18 months. 18 months. Michelle stood very still with that number. 18 months of Vanessa sitting across from her at coffee shops, listening to her fears about her marriage with practiced sympathy, all while being the very reason those fears existed. 18 months of Robert coming home late, sleeping with his back to her, and making her feel that the growing emptiness between them was somehow her failure. 18 months of being the last person in her own life to know the truth. What came next happened with a terrible efficiency that confirmed what her body already understood before her mind could accept it. This had been planned. Every detail arranged in advance. Every exit sealed before she even knew she was in a burning building. Robert led her to the dining table, not to sit, but to sign. A lawyer had already been retained. The divorce papers were prepared and waiting. The apartment, which Michelle had believed was held jointly, had been quietly transferred to Vanessa's name through a legal maneuver Robert's lawyer had arranged 6 months prior. The car, the business shares she had never technically been given formal ownership of despite the years of work she had poured into their value. The joint accounts, which Robert had been systematically moving funds out of, leaving a balance so negligible it bordered on mockery. Everything she had helped build had been legally removed from her reach before she ever walked through that door. She was handed a single suitcase, already packed, she noticed. Someone had gone through her belongings and selected what they considered sufficient. Her hands shook as she took the handle. She did not look at Vanessa again. She could not afford to. Robert opened the front door. The gesture was almost polite. "I hope you find what you're looking for," he said. She walked out without answering. The rain started before she reached the street. She stood on the pavement outside their building with a suitcase in one hand and 7 years dissolving in the rain around her, and she could not, for several long minutes, remember which direction she was supposed to walk. By morning, the story had already traveled through their social circle with the speed that only scandal achieves. Phones lit up across the city. Messages were exchanged in group chats Michelle had once been part of. Former friends, women who had eaten at her table, complimented her cooking, borrowed her advice, laughed behind manicured hands at what they called her fall from grace, as though grace was something that could be taken from a person by someone else's betrayal. Colleagues of Robert's, men and women who had smiled warmly at Michelle for years, chose a side with the practiced ease of people who understood which way power was now pointing. Robert's family, his mother, who Michelle had nursed through an illness 2 winters ago, his brothers whose children Michelle had remembered at every birthday, refused her calls. Every single one. She stood outside a pharmacy the morning after, phone pressed to her ear, listening to the same silence repeat itself across every number she had believed was family. She was not angry. She was not even, in those first raw hours, particularly sad in the way she had always imagined devastation would feel. She was simply hollow, scraped clean of everything she had organized her identity around. She walked out into a city that had known her only as Robert's wife and understood, with a quiet that settled into her bones, that she was going to have to find out, for the first time in 7 years, who Michelle Andera actually was when there was no one left to be invisible for. She had nothing but her name, and even that, standing in the rain outside a life that had just been erased, felt borrowed. But somewhere beneath the hollow, beneath the rain and the suitcase and the unanswered calls and the 18 months of lies, something small and stubborn refused to go out entirely. It did not feel like strength yet. It barely felt like anything. But it was still there. And it was enough. It had to be enough. Because when Michelle Andera boarded a bus out of the city 3 days after the night her world collapsed, that small, stubborn flicker was the only thing she was carrying that hadn't been taken from her. Not the apartment, not the savings, not the friendships she had believed were real, or the family she had served for years, or the 7 years of her life she had poured into a man who had been quietly planning her removal while she was busy being devoted to him. She chose a seat near the back of the bus and watched the city she had known disappear through rain-streaked glass, and she made herself a single promise, the only one she had the strength to make in that moment. She would not go back. Not to Robert. Not to that version of herself. Not to the life she had spent 7 years making herself smaller to fit inside. Whatever came next, she would face it standing forward. She just didn't know yet how long forward would take to arrive. The town she found herself in had no particular significance. It was simply the place where the bus stopped when she finally decided she had gone far enough. Small streets, quiet mornings, the kind of place where nobody knew anybody else's business because everybody was too busy managing their own. She found the room above the laundromat on her second day, advertised on a handwritten card in the window of a corner grocery store. The landlady, a compact, unsentimental woman in her 60s, named Mrs. Parsons, asked no questions beyond whether Michelle could pay the first month in advance. Michelle counted out the bills from the thin envelope of cash she had managed to withdraw before Robert's lawyer had finalized the account transfers, handed them across, and was given a key attached to a small wooden tag with the number 4 painted on it. The room was not much. A single bed with a headboard that leaned slightly to the left, a window that looked out onto the laundromat's ventilation shaft, a small wooden desk wedged beneath the windowsill, its surface worn smooth by whoever had sat there before her, a bathroom the size of a generous closet. Michelle set her suitcase down in the center of the room and stood very still for a long moment, taking in the particular silence of a space that held no memory of her, no expectation, no disappointment, no history at all. For the first time in 7 years, A room asked nothing of her. She sat on the edge of the bed, and for 3 days she barely moved. The grief arrived not as she had expected, not as dramatic collapse, not as rage, but as a profound and total exhaustion. As though her body, having held itself together through the shock of betrayal and the mechanics of leaving, finally understood it was somewhere safe enough to fall apart, and fell apart completely and without ceremony. She slept for hours at a stretch and woke feeling no more rested. She ate when she remembered to, crackers, tinned soup, whatever required the least effort to prepare. She sat at the small desk and stared at the wall and thought about nothing in particular, which was somehow worse than thinking about something specific, because the nothing had a weight to it that pressed down steadily and without relief. The voice was the hardest part. Not Robert's voice. She had grown practiced at filtering that out. The voice she struggled against in those long, still nights above the laundromat was her own. The one that went through the evidence methodically and kept arriving at the same conclusion, that she had let this happen. That a woman with eyes and intelligence and the capacity to read a room had chosen, repeatedly, to misread the room she lived inside. That the warning signs had been present for years, and she had collected them quietly and filed them away under love when she should have filed them under truth. She lay on the bed with its slightly tilted headboard and stared at the ceiling and listened to that voice and understood, at some point during the second week, that she had a choice about what to do with it. She could let it become the story she told about herself, or she could let it become the last story she told about herself. The notebook was Mrs. Parsons', left in the desk drawer along with a ballpoint pen that still had ink, perhaps forgotten by a previous tenant. Michelle found it while looking for nothing in particular, and she opened it to the first blank page and sat with it for a long time before she wrote anything. When she finally wrote, it was not about Robert. It was not about Vanessa. It was not about grief or betrayal, or the 18 months of lies that she still had not entirely finished processing. She wrote about a gap she had identified in the logistics sector 3 years ago, when she had been managing Robert's supplier relationships, and noticed an inefficiency that nobody seemed interested in solving. She wrote about the market analysis she had quietly assembled in her head over months of observation, never shared, because Robert had made clear early on that her business instincts were not something he considered valuable input. She wrote about a distribution model she had once sketched on a napkin during a dinner party when the conversation had moved to territory she understood better than anyone in the room, a napkin she had folded into her pocket and later thrown away because there had seemed to be no point in keeping it. She wrote for 2 hours without stopping. When she finally set down the pen, something had shifted, imperceptibly but unmistakably, in the atmosphere of that small room. She opened the notebook again the next morning, and the morning after that. She found a second-hand bookstore 4 streets away that sold business literature by weight. She spent what she could afford and carried the books back in a paper bag and read them at the small desk with a worn surface, taking notes in the margins with Mrs. Parsons' ballpoint pen. Strategy, finance, market analysis, leadership, organizational behavior. Subjects she had taught herself partially over years of practical necessity, now approached with the focused intensity of someone who understood that knowledge, unlike apartments and savings and jewelry, was something nobody could transfer out of her name. She read until midnight. She woke at 6 and read again. She filled the notebook and bought another one from the grocery store on the corner. The pages accumulated. Ideas, frameworks, analyses, business models constructed from observation and instinct in the years of quiet, unacknowledged competence she had spent inside Robert's orbit. The voice that had whispered she deserved her destruction grew quieter, not because she silenced it forcibly, but because she simply gave herself better things to listen to. She had been in the town for 4 months when she walked into the corner brew on a gray Wednesday morning and sat down at a table near the window with her 3rd notebook and a cup of coffee she allowed herself as a daily indulgence. She did not notice the man at the next table until he spoke. "I'm sorry, I don't mean to intrude, but is that a demand-side market analysis you're working on?" She looked up. He was younger than she expected from the voice, mid-30s, with the kind of direct, unhurried gaze that belonged to people who were genuinely comfortable with silence and therefore didn't feel the need to fill it unnecessarily. He was looking at her notebook with an expression of undisguised professional curiosity. "It is," she said carefully. "For which sector?" "Logistics. Distribution inefficiencies in the mid-range supply chain." Something shifted in his expression. He leaned forward slightly. "That's a very specific gap. Most people don't see it until it costs them." "I know," Michelle said. "I watched it cost someone considerably for 3 years." He extended his hand across the narrow gap between their tables. "Evan Hartwell." She looked at the hand for a moment. Then she took it. "Michelle," she said. And then, with a quiet deliberateness that surprised even herself, "Michelle Andera. Not Robert's wife. Not the woman who had been discarded and discussed and dismissed. Not the version of herself that had been defined entirely in relation to someone else's story. Simply herself. Her own name. Her own beginning." The conversation that followed lasted 4 hours, and by the end of it Michelle understood 2 things with equal clarity: that Evan Hartwell was building something genuinely significant, and that somewhere over the course of 4 months in a small room above a laundromat, she had quietly rebuilt herself into someone significant enough to be part of it. She accepted his offer of a junior position at Hartwell Corporation on a Thursday morning, signed the offer letter at the small worn desk, and allowed herself, for the first time since the night of the groceries and the candles that were never lit, to feel something that resembled anticipation rather than dread. Within 6 months, she had restructured an entire failing department with the calm efficiency of someone who had been doing exactly this kind of work for years without credit. Within a year, she was heading the strategy division, the youngest person ever to hold the position, a fact the board noted with a particular mixture of admiration and slight discomfort that genuine competence tends to produce in people who hadn't expected it. Within 2 years, she was the woman every board member wanted in the room. And Evan Hartwell, who had built his company on the principle of surrounding himself with people smarter than his own blind spots, found himself doing something he had not anticipated when he offered a quiet, serious woman a junior position in a small-town cafe. He fell in love, not with the idea of her, not with a version he had constructed or projected, but with the actual, specific, complicated, extraordinary woman who had been shattered by someone who couldn't see her value and had spent a long winter in a room above a laundromat reconstructing herself from the ground up, one morning at a time. He told her this plainly, the way he did everything, without performance, without strategy, without an agenda beyond the simple truth of it. She believed him, not immediately, not without the careful, measured caution of a woman who had learned the hard way what it costs to believe without evidence. But Evan was patient in the way that people are patient when they are certain, and slowly, with the same deliberateness she had brought to rebuilding every other part of herself, Michelle allowed herself to be loved by someone who actually meant it. They married quietly on a Saturday in early autumn. No grand announcement, no social media spectacle. No guest list assembled for appearances. Just 2 people in a sun-filled room, choosing each other with the kind of absolute certainty that only people who have survived their own winters truly understand. Michelle Andera was gone. Michelle Hartwell had arrived. And the world, though it did not know it yet, was about to find out exactly what that meant. It began, as most seismic shifts do, not with a dramatic announcement, but with a single line in a financial bulletin that most people read over their morning coffee and forgot by noon. A brief corporate notice, clinical in its language, stating that Hartwell Corporation had initiated a strategic acquisition process targeting expanded operations in the country's primary commercial district. 14 words that meant nothing to most people. To those who understood the architecture of power in that city, who owned what, who owed whom, whose foundations were solid and whose were constructed on carefully maintained appearances, those 14 words landed like the first tremor before an earthquake. Quiet, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably the signal that something large was moving. Within 48 hours, the bulletin had become a headline. Within a week, the headline had become a story. And at the center of that story, photographed with the composed authority of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by her own capability, was Michelle Hartwell, co-CEO of Hartwell Corporation, architect of its most aggressive expansion strategy to date, and the woman that the business press had spent the past 3 years running out of superlatives to describe. Sharp, fearless, untouchable. The magazine cover that ran that Thursday showed her standing at a floor-to-ceiling window overlooking a city skyline, her expression neither warm nor cold but simply certain, the expression of a woman who had decided, some years ago, exactly who she was going to be, and had since been quietly becoming it. Robert saw that cover on the coffee table of his lawyer's waiting room. He sat with it in his hands for a long time without speaking. The unease he felt was not guilt, or not primarily guilt. It was something more specifically unsettling than that. It was the particular discomfort of a man who had made a calculation and was now being forced to confront, in the most public and irrefutable terms possible, exactly how wrong that calculation had been. He had told himself, in the years since the divorce, a story that was livable, that Michelle had been adequate, a decent enough partner for the early years, but ultimately limited. That his decision had been a rational one, a necessary upgrade. That Vanessa, with her social connections and her confident understanding of the world he was building toward, had been the right choice for the man he was becoming. He had told himself the story often enough that it had acquired the texture of truth. The woman on the magazine cover made the story impossible to maintain. He set the magazine down when his lawyer entered the room and said nothing about it. But the image stayed with him through the entire meeting, through the drive home, through the dinner he barely touched while Vanessa talked about a renovation project with the animated confidence of someone who did not yet understand that the ground beneath their particular empire had begun, very quietly, to shift. Vanessa's company had been called Velour Group, a name she had chosen for its suggestion of luxury, of surfaces that were smooth and expensive to the touch. And the surface, for several years, had been impressively maintained. Her social network was formidable. Her client list gleamed with recognizable names. She hosted the right events, appeared in the right publications, cultivated the right relationships with the practiced expertise of someone who understood that in certain circles, perception and reality were functionally interchangeable. But underneath the surface, the structure that supported it had been built with methods that required constant, careful concealment. The falsified contracts had begun small, adjusted figures here, renegotiated terms buried in amendments there, the kind of discrepancies that fell beneath the threshold of standard auditing scrutiny. The embezzled funds had been routed through a series of subsidiary accounts whose complexity had been specifically designed to make tracing them prohibitively time-consuming. The investor fraud had relied on the foundational assumption that nobody would look too closely as long as the returns appeared consistent and the presentation remained confident. It had worked, for years, because nobody had looked closely. Hartwell Corporation looked closely at everything. Michelle had built the corporation's due diligence division with the same meticulous attention she had once brought to managing Robert's supplier relationships, a personal philosophy that every number told a story, and that the most important stories were the ones hidden in the gaps between the numbers. When the acquisition team began their analysis of the commercial landscape in the city, the irregularities in Vanessa's financials emerged not as dramatic discoveries, but as the inevitable conclusion of careful, patient work. The legal process that followed was not something Michelle initiated personally. It was the natural consequence of documentation being referred, as it was required to be, to the appropriate regulatory authorities. She did not make calls. She did not apply pressure. She simply ensured that what her team found was accurately and completely reported, as any responsible corporate entity was obligated to do. The rest unfolded on its own. Robert's request to meet reached her through Daniel Marsh, a mutual acquaintance from the years when she and Robert had moved through the same social circles, a man who had always been privately decent to Michelle, even when it hadn't been fashionable to be. He called her assistant with a careful, slightly uncomfortable message that Robert was requesting 10 minutes of her time at the upcoming industry gala. Michelle was quiet for a moment when her assistant relayed the message. "Tell Mr. Marsh I'll be attending the gala," she said. "If Robert wants to speak, he can find me there." She did not say yes. She did not say no. She simply appeared, as she always did now, on her own terms in her own time. The gala was held in the grand ballroom of the city's most prestigious hotel. The same hotel, Michelle noted without particular emotion, where Robert had once hosted a celebration for a business milestone that she had spent 3 weeks organizing behind the scenes, and at which she had been introduced to 3 separate guests as "my wife," without her name attached. She arrived on Evan's arm in a dress the color of deep midnight, her hair swept back with the simplicity of someone who understood that the most powerful statement a woman in that room could make was to appear completely, entirely at ease. Evan's hand was warm at the small of her back, his presence beside her the particular kind of steady that she had spent years not knowing she deserved. The room noticed her entrance. She had known it would. She had not come for the room's attention. She had never particularly wanted it, but she was no longer willing to make herself invisible simply because visibility was uncomfortable. The whispers moved through the gathered crowd with a speed that only recognition produces. "Is that Michelle Hartwell? She looks—" I heard she heard fragments of it and felt nothing in particular. She had stopped being defined by what rooms said about her on the night she boarded a bus in the rain with a single suitcase. Whatever these people said now was simply weather, present, and then passing. She moved through the evening with the composed ease of someone who had somewhere genuine to be and no performance to maintain. She spoke with industry colleagues whose respect she had earned through work, not proximity to someone else's ambition. She laughed with Evan at something a board member said near the appetizer table. She was, in every observable way, simply herself, which was, she had discovered, the most powerful thing she had ever learned to be. Robert found her near the balcony, just before 10 o'clock. She had seen him earlier in the evening across the room and noted, with the dispassionate clarity that time and distance had given her, how much had changed in 5 years. The easy confidence that had once been his most defining characteristic had contracted into something tighter. He moved through the room carefully, she thought, like a man who was conscious of exactly which conversations he needed to have and which ones he needed to avoid, which was the movement of someone managing a situation rather than commanding one. He looked older, the kind of older that comes not from years but from sustained, unresolved anxiety. When he approached her, she turned to face him with an expression that gave him nothing, not warmth, not coldness, not the satisfaction of visible victory or the vulnerability of old pain. Simply presence, simply a woman who had agreed to this conversation and was now having it. "Michelle." His voice was quieter than she remembered. "I know I have no right to ask." He paused, and she waited, and the pause stretched between them like the 5 years it contained. "But if you could just not pursue this further, leave our side of things alone." She looked at him for a long moment, at the face she had once loved with everything she had, at the eyes that had looked at her across their living room and delivered a verdict she had spent a long winter recovering from, at the man who had handed her a suitcase and opened the door and believed, apparently with complete sincerity, that the story ended there. She set her glass down slowly on the balcony railing. When she spoke, her voice was even, unhurried, the voice of a woman who had nothing to prove and therefore nothing to perform. "Robert," she said, "I didn't come here for you. I came because this is good business. But if your company falls apart in the process, that has nothing to do with me. That's the consequence of the foundation you chose to build it on." She picked up her glass. She walked away without looking back. And this time, unlike the last time she had walked away from Robert in the rain with a borrowed suitcase and a borrowed sense of her own name, she walked away toward something, toward the room that was waiting for her, toward Evan, who would find her in 20 minutes and ask if she was all right with the genuine, unhurried interest of a man who actually wanted to know, toward the life she had built from nothing in a small room above a laundromat, one morning at a time, with a borrowed pen and a notebook and the stubborn, unkillable refusal to let someone else's verdict become her truth. She did not look back. There was nothing behind her worth turning around for. She had known this, in the abstract, for some time. But there is a difference between knowing something and feeling it settle into your bones with the permanence of something that will never again need to be questioned. Walking away from Robert at that balcony, walking away from the last remnant of the version of herself that had organized her entire existence around his approval, was the moment the knowing became the feeling. She found Evan near the bar exactly 22 minutes later. He looked up when she approached, read something in her expression that required no explanation, and handed her a fresh glass of sparkling water with the quiet attentiveness of a man who had long since learned to pay attention to the right things. "All right?" he asked. "Yes," she said, and meant it completely. They left the gala early, which was something Michelle Hartwell could afford to do because her presence in a room had long since stopped being something she needed to negotiate or justify. They drove home through the illuminated city in comfortable silence, Evan's hand resting over hers on the center console, and Michelle watched the lights pass and thought about very little, which was, she had come to understand, the particular luxury of a life in which the most difficult questions had already been answered. She did not know, on that evening, exactly how quickly the avalanche would arrive. It came within 3 weeks. The indictment of Vanessa Lord was announced on a Tuesday morning, the same day of the week, Michelle noted with a quietness that was not quite irony, as the night her first life had ended. The charges were read into the public record with the flat, procedural language of legal process, which somehow made them more devastating than drama could have achieved. 17 counts, each one a layer of the construction peeled back to reveal the rot beneath. Financial fraud, falsification of business documents, breach of fiduciary duty, conspiracy to deceive investors, misappropriation of corporate funds across a period of 4 years. The Velour Group's offices were sealed before noon. Asset freezing orders were executed across 6 accounts. The company's client list, those carefully curated names that had given the enterprise its gleaming surface, began issuing public statements of distance with the practiced swiftness of organizations that employed excellent communications teams precisely for moments like this. Vanessa herself appeared at the courthouse with a lawyer on each side and an expression that Michelle, watching the news footage from her office, recognized immediately. It was the expression of someone who had spent years performing certainty so consistently that they had forgotten it was a performance, and who was now, in the unsparing light of public accountability, discovering that the performance had no power over reality. The woman who had sat in Michelle's living room with Robert's arm around her, who had listened to Michelle's private fears over coffee and relayed them to the man who was planning to use them, who had smiled at Michelle's departure with the quiet triumph of someone who believed they had won. That woman sat in a courtroom now and watched everything she had constructed dissolve around her. Michelle watched the footage for exactly 2 minutes. Then she closed the browser tab and returned to the quarterly projections her team needed reviewed by end of day. She had work to do. She had always had work to do. The difference now was that the work was entirely, completely her own. Robert's unraveling followed a trajectory that those who understood the situation had seen coming from the moment the investigation began. Not because Michelle had engineered it, but because Robert had made a series of choices over a number of years that had embedded his name and his signature and his decisions into the very structure of Vanessa's fraudulent enterprise. He had signed documents without reading them carefully. He had accepted financial arrangements without asking questions whose answers he had preferred not to know. He had placed himself at the center of an operation whose stability depended entirely on nothing being examined too closely, and then had the profound misfortune of being examined closely by people who were exceptionally good at exactly that. His company was placed under regulatory review within a month of Vanessa's indictment. The review found what reviews conducted by competent people tend to find when the underlying reality has been managed rather than resolved. His assets were frozen pending investigation. His board resigned in succession over a period of 2 weeks, each departure a public confirmation of what the financial community had already concluded. The colleagues who had celebrated him found urgent reasons to be elsewhere. The business relationships he had cultivated with years of careful social navigation evaporated with a speed that would have been remarkable if it weren't so entirely predictable, because those relationships had always been transactional, built on the assumption of his continued usefulness, and usefulness was the one thing he no longer had to offer. His family, his mother who had never learned Michelle's contributions, his brothers who had sought his advice, his father who had boasted of him to neighbors, found themselves standing behind a door that no longer existed. The house had been seized, the accounts frozen, the empire that Robert had declared Michelle unworthy of sharing had turned out, in the end, to be constructed of the same materials as everything Vanessa built: surface performance, and the persistent hope that nobody would ever look beneath. The charges against Robert were filed on a Wednesday afternoon. Co-conspirator, accessory to fraud, knowing participation in the falsification of documents he had signed. Michelle was in a meeting with her senior strategy team when her assistant slipped a note onto the table beside her. She read it without expression, folded it once, and set it aside. Then, she returned her attention to the presentation her team had been delivering and asked a question about third-quarter projections that had nothing to do with Robert or Vanessa or the world that was currently collapsing several miles away. Because her world was here, and it was built on things that held. They came to her one by one, in the weeks and months that followed. Some came with apologies that were genuine, halting, uncomfortable, the kind that arrive when a person has sat long enough with their own behavior to understand it clearly. A former friend who had laughed at Michelle's departure sent a letter, handwritten, 3 pages long, that Michelle read in full and set aside with something that was not quite forgiveness yet, but was the beginning of its possibility. Some came with excuses, elaborate reconstructions of events designed to minimize personal culpability, delivered with the hopeful energy of people who believed that a good enough explanation could retroactively alter what they had done. Michelle listened to these with the patient attention she gave to everything and responded with a grace that was entirely genuine, because she had learned in a room above a laundromat that carrying anger at people who were not worth its weight was simply a way of continuing to let them cost her something. And some came because they needed something, because Michelle Hartwell was now the most influential name in the commercial landscape of a city that had once dismissed her, and proximity to that influence had a value that certain people calculated with the same instincts they applied to everything. These she recognized immediately and received with equal courtesy, helping where help was warranted and declining where it was not, guided entirely by the simple question of whether assistance served something real or simply served an appetite she had no obligation to feed. She did not need to perform magnanimity. She simply practiced it because it was who she had decided to be in a long winter that had burned away everything she didn't need. Hartwell Corporation's expansion into the city became, over the following 2 years, the case study that business schools would use for a decade to illustrate the difference between growth built on integrity and growth built on performance. Michelle's strategic vision, the framework she had first sketched in notebooks in a small room, the analyses that had begun as private thoughts dismissed by a man who didn't recognize their value, became the architecture of something genuinely lasting. She spoke at conferences with the directness of someone who had nothing to sell beyond what she actually believed. She sat on panels and said things that were true rather than things that were comfortable, which was unusual enough in those settings to be noticed and respected. She wrote an annual letter to Hartwell Corporation stakeholders that people in the industry read not for the financial data, but for the clarity of thinking it contained. And she mentored. This, perhaps, was the work that meant most to her, the hours spent with young women who arrived in her office carrying the particular exhaustion of people who had been diminished by systems or relationships, or the quiet, persistent message that their capabilities were not as significant as someone else's comfort. She recognized them immediately. She knew the specific quality of their silence, the way they prefaced insights with apologies, the way they waited for permission to occupy space they had already earned. She did not tell them her story immediately or completely. She listened first, always, and then she said the things she had needed someone to say to her in a small room above a laundromat, when the only voice she had was her own, and it was not always kind. You are not what was done to you. You are what you choose to build from it. It was a Thursday evening in early autumn when she stood on the penthouse balcony for the first time since they had moved in and allowed herself to simply be still. The city spread below her in every direction, illuminated and indifferent and vast, the same city that had watched her leave with a suitcase in the rain, the same city that had whispered about her fall with the casual cruelty of people who have never had to rebuild anything. It looked different from here. Not smaller, exactly. Just in its proper proportion. Evan appeared behind her with 2 cups of tea and set one on the railing beside her hand without interrupting the silence. She had always loved this about him. His instinct for when presence was enough and words were unnecessary. His absolute comfort with quiet that contained nothing it needed to explain. She picked up the cup. The city hummed below them, indifferent and eternal, going about its business the way cities always do, without memory, without apology, without particular interest in the individual stories being lived inside it. She thought about the Tuesday morning 7 years ago when she had placed a flower on a breakfast table that no one noticed. She thought about a velvet pouch passed across a jeweler's counter. She thought about a bus pulling away from a city in the rain. She thought about a notebook found in a desk drawer with a pen that still had ink. She thought about all of it with the equanimity of someone for whom the past had become neither wound nor trophy but simply the path. The specific, necessary, unrepeatable path that had led from there to here. She was not complete because she had won. She was not complete because they had fallen. She was complete because she had walked every step of the distance between the woman who had loved without limit and the woman who now stood here, and she had walked it honestly, without shortcuts, without bitterness, without ever allowing someone else's definition of her to become the one she lived by. She had become, fully and finally, herself. And herself, it turned out, had always been more than enough. The city glittered below. The tea was warm in her hands. Evan stood beside her in the particular silence of a life that was real and chosen and built on things that held. Michelle Hartwell looked out at the empire of her own making and felt, beneath the achievement and the resilience and the long journey of becoming, something she recognized at last as peace. Not the peace of surrender, the peace of arrival,